Not my fault.
Yes.
Hey. Good to see you. You alright?
Yes.
All right, everybody, thank you for coming. Can I have your attention, please? Thank you. Thank you for coming. Tonight we're going to be talking about Nietzsche and art. So last time we talked about Nietzsche's very, very important teaching, which was the will to power. Tonight we're going to be talking about his teaching on art, and I will try to explain to you why is art for Nietzsche so important. Why art? I would like to remind everyone that, because this is obviously necessary, this issue comes later on in discussion. I would like to remind everybody that Nietzsche is not an egalitarian philosopher. So he doesn't talk to everybody. He's not like Kant. He doesn't try to create laws, moral laws, aesthetic laws, which will apply to everyone. Nietzsche is not that type of a philosopher. Nietzsche talks to the specific higher type of man that he calls Übermensch or Overman. We spoke last time about it and the difficulties of understanding what is Overman. Who are this higher type of man that he talks about? In his first book, which is The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872, Nietzsche clearly explains who are these higher men. And for him, these higher men that he calls more nobly formed natures, these higher men are people who suffer more than anybody else. So they don't really bother about everyday suffering. They suffer in a very different way. They suffer for the whole of humanity. They suffer because they understand the condition, human condition, or problem of human existence, which is not suffering, but is the meaninglessness of suffering. So it's the meaninglessness of suffering that Nietzsche wants to overcome. It's not suffering itself. So Nietzsche inherits philosophically, inherits obviously the philosophy of Christianity, which he despises more than anybody else. And also he inherits Schopenhauer's philosophy of pessimism. Schopenhauer is the huge German philosopher who was actually Nietzsche's one and only teacher, great Arthur Schopenhauer, as Nietzsche says himself. So Nietzsche learned philosophy from Schopenhauer, but he didn't agree with him. Because for Schopenhauer, suffering was an obstacle. Suffering was something that should be avoided. For Nietzsche, suffering is not a problem. For Nietzsche, the problem is the meaninglessness of suffering. And Nietzsche says it later on in Genealogy of Morality. He says, man, the strongest animal, doesn't run away from suffering. He's ready to suffer horribly, as long as he knows why is he suffering for. As we know, we do suffer voluntarily if we know why we are suffering for. For example, you're going to suffer going on university, but you know why you're suffering, so you do that voluntarily, so you don't run away from that. And it's something positive in that suffering. So Nietzsche doesn't talk about everyday suffering, toothache, broken arm, wounded in war in the leg or something like that. This suffering doesn't interest him. And also this is not the suffering he talks about when he talks about more nobly formed natures or higher type of man. So this higher type of man suffers because he understands the human condition. The human condition is that life is full of suffering. Suffering is unavoidable. It's ubiquitous. ineluctable. So what do we do with it? Should we succumb to suffering, as Schopenhauer taught, or Christianity? Or maybe we should use suffering for some other reason, maybe for the purpose of justifying life. So, using suffering as a platform to justify life, this is the subject of the book called The Birth of Tragedy, which is all about art. And this is why art for Nietzsche is very, very important. Helps us to justify and also affirm life. Art helps us to make sure that life is worth living, contrary to Schopenhauer, who taught that life is not worth living, and therefore pessimism is the only way out. So what Nietzsche do in The Birth of Tragedy? How Nietzsche conquers this big issue of overcoming the meaninglessness of suffering. So Nietzsche talks about, as he sees it, the apex of art, which is tragedy, especially Attic tragedy, and he explains the very complicated dynamics of tragedy, dynamics of the plot, and also dynamics of the music. So in tragedy, in Greek tragedy, you had chorus of satyrs, and that chorus will sing and will dance throughout the tragedy. And then you have a plot. So that chorus was directly related to music, as Nietzsche sees music as Dionysian art, right? Dionysian art. Dionysus is the god of wine, the god of sexual frenzy, god who was reborn constantly, although being killed. So Dionysus is undercurrent of life, is eternal life for Nietzsche. Now there is another art there, which is Apollonian art, and this is the art within the plot. So Apollonian art is plastic art, and is related to the feeling of the beautiful. So what is Apollonian art? Paintings, sculptures, and also poetry. Visual art. So how can poetry be visual art? What do you think? But we visualize. When you read a poem and you start crying, you visualize something from your past, something from your memory, or you start laughing because again you visualize something, you see images, you see people. This is literally a plastic art and belongs to Apollonian arts. So we have two different arts in tragedy. Apollonian, which is visual, this is what you see on the scene, and this is what you hear, this is the plot. And you have the Dionysian art, which is music. So now why those two arts are important? Tragedy is a very, very complex type of art, and it was scrutinized in the history of philosophy first by Aristotle. In his Poetics, he talks about tragedy. And Aristotle comes to the conclusion that the main benefit of tragedy is actually experiencing catharsis, or purification of what? Purification of the feelings of fear and pity. Because while watching tragedy, for example, Oedipus Rex, you experience fear throughout, and you feel pity for King Oedipus, because he is killing his father and marrying his mother without knowing it. So throughout the tragedy, you're full of emotion, and you literally get rid of those emotions watching the tragedy, experiencing the tragedy. So this is that catharsis for Aristotle, purification of the feelings of pity and fear. Schopenhauer takes that from Aristotle, and he says tragedy is the best type of art that proves that life is not worth living, because the hero dies, but not because it's his fault. It dies unjustifiably. So Schopenhauer takes tragedy as the best example why life is not worth living. So he, in a way, agrees with Aristotle on tragedy. Now Nietzsche sees that completely wrong, and he uses the tragedy in order to justify life. So how is that possible? So, as I said, we have Apollonian art, which is based on illusion and the feeling of the beautiful. So while experiencing the feeling of the beautiful, you can imagine that yourself, one has to employ illusion, and you enter some state of dreaming. So you literally dream, and you want to dream forever, as Nietzsche said. Just let it keep on dreaming. This is how we experience the feeling of the beautiful. So that Apollonian illusion applies to that feeling, which resembles dream. And you don't want to get out of the dream, you want to dream. So that's Apollonian illusion. Now, Dionysian illusion is very different. This is music now. So what music does to us? Music brings us down, because for Nietzsche, also for Schopenhauer, this is most powerful art, because it's not visual. We hear music. And music brings us down to the eternal current of life. Music helps us to identify, in tragedy especially, to identify with everybody else, with other people, and also with nature. So through music, we get into that universal eternal life, which is not worried or concerned about our individual lives. So we become part of something much bigger, not just our life, my life. I'm Peter, and I'm a teacher, and I have a wife with 2 kids, and that's it. And they have tons of problems. But then John has the same problems, etc., etc. This type of problems, they are irrelevant when it comes to that eternal life. We all belong to that universal being, eternal, pulsating river of life. Music is the art that helps us experience that deep undercurrent energy, which we are all part of, as we all often feel that. For example, you go to the concert, right? Some big rock concert or something like that, and you have 50,000 people. And they enjoy that music so much that they forget about their individual destinies, individual lives. They identify with everybody else. Even better example is when you watch, for example, Manchester United or Chelsea winning, and then you have 70,000 people, but when United scores a goal, they all jump, all of a sudden. They have the same feeling, they belong to one. And that stadium, if you ever go to big matches or big concerts, you should look as a philosopher, or maybe as a psychologist, or maybe as a sociologist. So instead of just focusing on the concert, look around and see how people identify themselves. They become one universal life. So music is the one that gives us that in tragedy. But Nietzsche says that is very dangerous, because Dionysian illusion is extremely powerful, and it can pull the individual into that stage of intoxication, from which the individual doesn't want to go, and it can completely shatter psychologically into pieces. This is where Apollonian art comes to rescue. We are watching the plot, we are listening to the music, we go down into that universal state of intoxication, but also at the same time the plot is going on. So we are reminded that we are still individuals. So basically Apollonian art helps us, pulls us back out of the intoxicated state, back into individual reality. So why is this important? This is important because through tragedy, Nietzsche says, we manage to see the other side, that universal part of us, thanks to music. And now we are looking at our individual lives very differently. We see ourselves as something much more valuable. Our everyday problems, suffering, issues, all of a sudden don't look that terrifying as they looked before, when we didn't experience this plot and this music through tragedy. So for Nietzsche, tragedy is the one that helps us, create the platform for justifying life. So he says when individual comes back out of that Dionysian experience, the individual now looks at life differently. He is happy to go on living, right? He is not scared of life, he is not depressed, he is not pessimistic, but now he understands that life is much more than he knew before. So in few sentences, this is the story of tragedy, and why for Nietzsche art is so important, because it helped us to justify and also affirm life. So why art? Why couldn't we justify and affirm life through philosophy maybe, or rationally? Well, Schopenhauer tried to do that. He didn't include any illusion, neither Apollonian or Dionysian, but he could not justify life. This is why he ended up with his pessimism. This is why he ended up with pessimism. So rationally, we cannot justify life. Schopenhauer is the best proof of that. So the only other way to justify life is actually through aesthetics, through tragedy. And this is why his famous quote from the tragedy is that only as an aesthetic phenomenon the world and existence can be eternally justified. So only as an aesthetic phenomenon, because we cannot justify that rationally. Now, we are almost coming to an end. Nietzsche talks a lot about art in The Birth of Tragedy, as I said, but also in The Gay Science, where he gives us a slightly different approach, but also a very proactive approach towards art. And if, for example, he says about art, he says, what can we learn from the artists? We can learn to make beautiful what is not beautiful in nature. And he says, I believe that in nature nothing is beautiful. It's us who create beautiful. So artists do that. They create beautiful feeling through their arts. So how do we do that? He says the same as artists. We have to go further away from the object we look at, as long as we still see that object like through some fog, but we are the ones who have to implement changes, who have to create something more to add to that vision of ours in order to create a beautiful feeling. But he says we don't want to just be artists, because the magic with artists stops the moment the art is done. But he says we want to be poets of our lives. We want to do that all the time. We want to make ourselves better and more beautiful. And then again, his famous aphorism from The Gay Science, as I mentioned last time, is very applicable universally to different teachings, but obviously to art. When Nietzsche talks about what is needful, one thing is needful, and he says to give style to one's character. So to give style to one's character, and he says this is performed by those who observe the strengths and weaknesses of their nature, and then give them an artistic plan, so that every single one of them becomes reason and art, and even weaknesses delight the eye. But it says weak characters, they are afraid of constraint of the style, because they see themselves defeated. Why defeated? Because when they look into their strengths and weaknesses, they don't want to see any weaknesses. So they run away from style. So giving style to one's character, again, is not for everybody. It's for those more nobly formed natures, for the strong characters who are able to look into themselves, see the strengths and weaknesses, and then give them an artistic plan, turn them into something beautiful, without eliminating weaknesses. So weaknesses stay there, but they're transformed. And this is the strength of character. This is giving style to one's character. So as you can see, even in the even in the gay science, art is much more than just pleasurable aesthetic feeling. Art is the tool, organon for us to affirm life. And in The Birth of Tragedy, he said, what is important is to see science through the lens of art, but art through the lens of life. So not just art for the sake of aesthetic pleasure, but through the lens of life. So the purpose of life is obviously to affirm life, not just to experience temporary small pleasures, but to take something much more out of it. So now art, how do we compare art with the reason? Art and illusion, artistic illusion with reason. What is the problem with reason? Why is Nietzsche so much concerned about reason? I've argued with some colleagues of mine, some Nietzsche scholars on that subject quite a lot. And they were, do you mind, please? I argued with people who actually saw The Birth of Tragedy as a pessimistic book, and I argue that this is not a pessimistic book. It is actually a book in which Nietzsche tries to affirm life. So their main their main argument was that Nietzsche had to employ illusion because he saw life as a pessimistic arena of human existence. This is why he had to employ illusion. And they also argued that illusion is non-epistemic warranty. So aesthetically warranted life is non-epistemic, which means it's not based on the reason or on the rational reasoning. It's something else. My argument was that obviously the nature of life and the nature of reality, the complexity of reality. I mean, what do we call real? What is real for us? Is it real just thing that we can rationally explain, that we can epistemically warrant? Is just that reality? Or maybe there is something more to reality. Maybe human reality, if not the reality of a tree or maybe a mouse, human reality is also the fabric of human reality. Nature is also made of illusions. We have illusions. We have the feeling of beautiful, the feeling of sublime. So this is part of our nature. So what do we do with that? Is that something that we can call real, or because it's not rationally explainable, is neuroscience still struggling to explain? We have to classify illusions, fears, desires, hopes, passions as something which is not real. I mean, for me, that's ridiculous. It's out of question. Of course it's real, because this is what we experience. If you look, for example, at the famous literature and characters throughout history, you have Faust, you have Raskolnikov, you have Anna Karenina, etc. All these characters were never real. They didn't exist. But we talk about them since the day they have been produced. For hundreds of years, we talk about it. That these characters are influencing millions of people who read it emotionally. Lots of people actually strengthen their characters by reading or maybe copying Raskolnikov or Faust or similar characters. So this, although illusory, epistemically warranted characters, because they never existed, have such a tremendous impact of human psyche, not just psyche, on our moral, on our decisions, creating our priorities. So clearly, we have to regard illusions as a part of aesthetic experience of the beautiful and the sublime, as something which is part of us, and give them right place. Nietzsche saw aesthetic experience of the beautiful and sublime, as well as tragic illusion, as fundamental for justifying and affirming life. Much more important than our rational apprehension of the world around us and the world inside us. So what about beautiful? What can we say about beautiful? For Kant and Schopenhauer, beautiful had to be something, experience of beautiful has to be disinterested. There must be no interest or desire towards the subject of artistic product. But when you see a painting of a naked woman, Kant would say that's not beautiful because it can arouse passion. It cannot be beautiful. Or you see food, for example. So if you're hungry, you're going to like the painting. But if you're not hungry, you're just going to look and walk away. So Kant says it must be disinterested. Schopenhauer agrees, it has to be disinterested. But Nietzsche says no, it has to be interested. You have to immerse yourself into that. And then he quotes Stendhal and his beautiful definition of beauty. And Stendhal says, beauty is the promise of happiness. So imagine, it's the promise of happiness. If it's a promise, that beauty is not the final destination. Beauty is not something that you will arrive at, but is the promise of what? Of happiness. This is why it's so attractive, that feeling to us. But to remain promise, it must not be final. Because promise doesn't guarantee good outcome. The outcome may be bad as well. So the feeling of the beautiful is powerful because it doesn't give us answer. As Nahamas, this very famous Nietzsche scholar, says something regarding beautiful, and also in regard to Stendhal's definition. He says, the feeling of beautiful, it seems to me as something that is calling me constantly, but I never know where I'm going. So artists probably have that experience quite often when they create something, but the perplexity of the nature of the feeling of the beautiful is always there. What it is, why do we need it so much? And Nietzsche wants us to create through that feeling, to add extra, the same as creators of art, but he wants us to be creators of our lives for good. Because as he says, for artists, the magic stops the moment the art is done. But we want to be poets of our lives. So I hope I managed to trigger interest in you with this short lecture. It couldn't be shorter because this is a huge subject. And I hope that you will come back to me now with your valuable questions and thoughts. So thank you very much.